Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Trowel Talk Live. I'm just delighted to introduce Belinda to talk about No Dig Borders. Now, both Belinda's parents, who were professionals in plant science and horticulture, tried to interest her in gardening, but it wasn't until she started to travel the world and saw the importance of home vegetable gardens to people at all levels of society that she caught the bug herself. She's a relatively new member of the Master Gardeners of Ottawa-Carleton, but she's already become an important member of our team, and I'm delighted to introduce her. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat and we'll deal with them at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. So my talk is about No Dig Gardens. Why would I want to create a new border? Well, my house is on a corner lot and it has a long cedar hedge running along the side. This is technically outside the boundary of the lot, but the hedge was planted before we bought the house over 20 years ago. So I have this strip of land running up the side of the house. The hedge is healthy, but it was pretty boring to look at, and it needed some other plants in front of it to create interest. Trying to maintain a lawn there was really difficult, as it's hard to keep watered, it's a school bus stop, and there have been various changes to the street furniture there by the city and Canada Post and so on. It also gets a lot of snow pushed onto it in the winter because it's on a corner. The snow isn't just plowed there, it's actually shoved up there for storage. And besides, I had extra plants, and this seemed to be a good solution to finding them homes, even after sharing some of them with fellow gardeners. So initially, I just planted some hollyhocks and some false sunflower through the grass, as well as some tulip bulbs to come up in the spring. So you can see these plants here just about differentiated from the green. And you can see that I had a drip line hose running through here, but I had to poke it through the hedge. So it was very difficult to water this area still. And I found it was quite difficult to actually even get the plants into the soil. But per plant, that wasn't really a problem. The plants struggled there, though, because of the quality of the soil, which was very poor. And there was competition from the lawn. And as I said, it was difficult to water them as well. You can see that I use the term lawn very loosely, as there are really more weeds and grass. And you can actually even see bare bits of soil coming through. But having said that, even this small amount of planting was enthusiastically received by my neighbours, which was really encouraging. They may have liked it, but I thought it was rather underwhelming, and I began to think about a larger border. In the meantime, I continued to add spare plants such as yarrow and daylilies and so on. The next year, right in the middle of COVID, I had decided I was going to create a large border to run along beside the cedar hedge. I planned to lift the turf and then dig the soil to create the border. I even bought a turf lifter. But as I started to dig into the soil, it became clear that this was going to be a very difficult task. This is the concrete clay that I would have had to deal with. You can see how solid the clay was, and the picture shows an interesting feature of clay soil. It can be crusted hard on the surface, so you can just see around the edges here where it's where the spade went in, and around this side too. It's quite dry, but it can still be moist underneath. And even though it's damp here, it's not malleable at all. And this is just one shovel full of soil, and you can just see how it's clinging together and stuck, and it's very, very hard. I'm not even sure what managed to make these holes, which were quite evident. There's a bunch of them there. The roots of a weed, perhaps a dandelion. It's unlikely to have been any sort of intrepid worm. When I saw this, I thought again. I returned the turf lifter and explored the possibility of a no-dig border. But first, let's have a look at clay soil. Clay soil consists of very, very small, flat mineral particles which are tightly stuck together. Clay actually has the smallest particles out of all the soil types, less than 0.002 millimeters in diameter. The sticky quality is due to the fact that the particles have a negative charge. The soil tends to have an alkaline pH, so it tests with numbers above 7. Due to the stickiness and the flat particles, there are few air spaces in the soil. The close particles also prevent water draining through effectively. So you can see how really consistent it is here. This looks almost just like the side of a clay pot, which it could be. And you can also see there are very little growth into the soil. When it's wet, clay soil is heavy and dense and sticky, and it takes a long time to dry out because there's so little air in it. When it's dry, it becomes extremely hard with a crust at the surface, and water can take time to infiltrate it because there are, again, no air pockets for the water to run through. It's just totally solid. It can also be slow to warm in the spring. Although clay soils can contain quite high levels of nutrients, plants can't access them because the roots have difficulty penetrating the dense soil. So as I said, there's very little root coming into here. I think this is actually, these 3 pieces fell onto it, and nothing really is penetrating this soil at all. All of these conditions also mean there is less active organic life in the soil in terms of bacteria, insects, and mycorrhizal fungi. Generally, soils that contain greater than 30% clay are considered unacceptable as topsoil material, according to a Utah State University fact sheet. And I think this picture shows almost 100% clay. By the way, sandy soils present almost the opposite set of conditions. They are fast draining and they have low nutrients, but they share the low level of organic matter. So sandy soils can also benefit from the no-dig method of border creation. So where to start and what to do? I had a rough idea of what was involved to create a no-dig border, sometimes called a lasagna border, so I turned to the internet for more information. The search terms you use are important. First, be careful not to confuse no-dig with no-till, which is a practice more associated with agriculture. Searching just no-dig border took me to pages advertising ways to edge borders with plastic rims and that sort of thing. A search for no-dig method gardening was more helpful, but it wasn't very elaborative in its information. Create a lasagna border was the most helpful search terms. I found several pages. Some of them were fairly brief, but 2 pages were particularly informative. The one contained an article from Mother Earth News from 1999, and the other was a page from the Garden Club of Camas, I think it is, in Washington State in 2015. And these were both much more valuable in terms of the information they contained. Also, you can ask a friend. My friend had created a no-dig border herself, and her advice was excellent. It boiled down to do it. So how does a no-dig border work? A no-dig border is a bit like a cross between a raised bed and a compost heap. And if you think about it, it's a well-established practice. For instance, plants often choose to grow on the compost heap anyway. Essentially, you're building up a higher level of soil for your border, combined with very nutritious material, which will benefit both your plants and ultimately the soil below. Any time of year is fine to just start one, perhaps not in our winter though. My border was created in the autumn, which gave it time to settle and for the layers to break down. The process of creating a no-dig border has several steps. First, a layer of material is planted over the ground to block out the light and thereby kill the grass and weeds underneath. So here's my clay, here are my weeds. I'm going to block out the light by putting a layer of thick excluding material over there. Secondly, organic material and a top layer of mulch provides nutrients and conserves moisture for your plants. And thirdly, the different layers involved create good conditions for planting, and as they break down over time, help to improve the underlying soil, and that promotes the development of other organic factors that sustain healthy soil. So what is the recipe? Before getting started on any layers, you need to water the garden or water the area to encourage the weeds and grass to grow. That seems completely counterproductive, but the idea is that this promotes a growth spurt which will not be supported by light because you're going to block that out, and so it helps to exhaust the weeds. Keeping the area damp also helps to maintain any other flora and fauna, such as worms, bacteria, and fungi, until the layers have settled and broken down. So this diagram shows the soil layer, the weeds, and the water coming down to moisturize it all, wetten it all. Then you apply a base layer, and you can use any of these for the light blocking layer. Newspaper, garden bags, cardboard, or straw. Avoid hay though, because it often contains a lot of grass seed, and then you're just restarting your problem. So the arrows represent the fact that this sort of layer will rest onto the weeds and crush them down, and then you water in this layer. Then you have middle layers of compostable material. So you can use anything on these layers that you would use in your compost heap, but as there, you would avoid animal products, including meat, dairy, and animal waste. So good candidates are grass clippings, garden trimmings, shredded leaves, old potting soil, kitchen scraps, and anything that you've taken out of your off the floor from your dog's hair, all that sort of thing. As the middle layers decompose, they provide the medium, the plants. And then the final layer is a mulch layer. You can use shredded bark, bark chips, more straw, or shredded leaves, or any combination of these. If you use shredded bark, it tends to break down and it will continue to improve the soil, but you'll need to replace it every few years. If you use bark chips, they will last longer, but they have less nutritive value. And again, the same applies as the shredded bark with the straw and the leaves. So just to go back to the diagram, here's the soil, the clay, the weeds, the pressure, the base layer, and every layer is separated by water, a whole load of composting layers, and water over the top. To be honest though, waiting for the various layers to break down into compost was going to take too long for my liking. So I chose a combination of garden bags for the first base layer, then a mixture of topsoil and compost, then shredded composted pine bark for the mulch. It seemed both the simplest and quickest way to create the border. So here we have our layers where we're going to cover, the pressure coming down. This was garden bags, water, the topsoil compost mix, water, and the shredded composted pine bark, water. So the first thing to do was to calculate the amounts of material required. I measured the length and the width of the planned border, and it was 17 meters by 1.5 meters, or if you want old money, as they say in England, 55 feet by 5 feet. I planned on using 7.5 centimeters or 3 inches for the soil compost layer and 3 inches for the mulch layer. I found a mulch calculator online, which told me how much I'd need for these quantities. The company I ordered from was also very helpful with checking that I was ordering the right amount for this type of project. They were able to deliver within a few days of my request, so I could make sure the material would arrive on a non-rainy day. And by the way, it's much, much more economical to have the material delivered loose rather than in big bags, and it's easier to use. It's easier because you can just come to here and access the material. You don't have to dig through the bag. You can cover the material with a tarp if it's in danger of getting rained on. Also, I asked the delivery man to put the soil layer further away and the mulch layer closer to the area. So my border is just around the corner from here. This is the soil layer and this is the mulch layer. So that as we got tired working through the day, there'd be less far to walk. We were going to use this layer, this pile first, and then move to this one, and then have less far to walk. I marked the outline of the border by digging along the intended edge. This gives an advanced idea of your plan and lets you assess the shape. You can make alterations if necessary. So for example, I had a different angle here and I wanted it more rounded. So I changed the sort of angle of this area up at the top of the border here. So you can make alterations like that. And it helps you stay on track for distributing the material equally and gives you an idea of the scope that you're going to be attacking. Then there were 3 more parts of the process that required measurement. The first was to make sure that the depth of each layer was even and accurate. So I made and placed measures that indicated 3 inches each of the soil compost mix and the mulch. The 6 here is at ground level, and the 3 is is the bottom of the first layer, and then this line is the finished layer that I wanted to have. Here you can see the measure beside a transplanted yarrow plant, one of the early plants. The paper has not yet settled into place, but the marker is accurate to the ground level, the original ground level. Secondly, I needed to make sure that we used the soil and mulch evenly. So I marked out the heaps into extremely rough thirds. So you can see the markers here in this heap of compost mix. So 1 marker, 2 markers, and then I'm going to take this portion for the first third, the center portion for the second third, and then this end portion is the third third. And you can see I did the same just about over here. And thirdly, I needed to make sure I spread the material evenly on the border. So the length of that was also marked into rough thirds, but I didn't take the picture till after the paper was in. So here is the first third up to the end, second third, and the third third here. So I enlisted the help of my daughter, and we split two ply garden bags open and laid them flat along the border area. Then we watered over the top to help speed up the process of breaking down the paper. As I've mentioned, we'd already watered this area of the garden bed before I dug the little side border here, or side of the border. And that actually also helped me turn that piece of ground over. After that, it was a lot of shoveling and wheelbarrow work to distribute the soil layer evenly over the paper and water it down. So here you can see us moving our way along here. You can see the hosepipe coming through the hedge. There's one of my markers. And here is the first layer set in and watered down. And then repeat with the mulch layer and add water. And then I started to add plants straight away. Basically, suitable plants were put in a fairly random way, because I didn't want this border to look designed. And also it was autumn, so any plants going in there needed time to settle into their new home. However, you can see, those sharp-eyed among you, that these are not plants that I might want in there. The dandelions persisted. They really did persist. And they came through everything. They came through, you can see from this is about six inches of root. And here is the dandelion top. So the dandelions are indefatigable. By 2022, I decided to check the soil layer to see how it was doing. You can see the material is breaking down. There's very little difference between the mulch layer now and the soil, composted soil. And there's a bit of an infiltration into the bottom clay layer here. I have found worms in it, but they're shy about being photographed. And here you'll see that the clay layer is beginning to break down. So it has a less uniform and solid and stuck look. It's better moistened most of the time. I think the moisture is maintained there better for all that extra material over the top anyway, which helps. And now I started to put in some plants for the early summer and spring. This is when this was taken, well, late spring, early summer. So here we have the Heliopsis really growing very well. I've got my yarrows, my daylilies and looking pretty good. I still got dandelions coming through, but I don't know what to do about that, except pull them up. I've got some rudbeckia to plant here, and you can just see the top of some annual salvia that I'm going to put in. So this is the garden in sort of midsummer now. You can see that the Heliopsis are flowering, and I've got the more flowers out and showing. And I've been steadily adding to the border throughout the season, and I'm considering making this now into a border to support pollinators. So I'll probably add some echinacea and other plants, but that's next year's project. Because of the snow piles, I am restricted really to perennials and annuals in here. I'm afraid that anything more solid like a shrub or even a small tree will be broken when the plough pushes the snow over. So I also need to bear in mind that this area will get salt from the snow. And because it's an area with clay, I need to consider plants that will tolerate clay and alkaline soils. So not surprisingly, that includes most of the plants you see grown in the Ottawa area. So I've added perennial salvias, coneflower, rudbeckia, milkweed, and then I have my original plants of the hollyhocks and so on. And the tulips did come up in the spring and they looked pretty happy about it. So you can see that no dig isn't quite no work, but it's less work. And aside from creating a new border, it was a great opportunity to chat with neighbours and maybe inspire one or two of them to try to do the same thing.
Thank you, Belinda. That was just delightful. Such a lot of learning on how to create a new garden without too much work, although we could see it was a lot of work. While we wait for people to put questions in the chat room, I had one myself, and it has to do with how did you have to add any earthworms or mycorrhizomes or something to get the earth to start to become healthier?
No, I just trusted nature to take its course, to be honest. And for one thing, on the other side of this hedge is another healthy growing border. So I reckon those worms could migrate if they found that conditions were going to be suitable, and the same for the bacteria. And I mean, probably the fungi are lying half dormant in that area anyway. So I think the added moisture helped improve the texture. The top two layers have both been composted, so they should be carrying a lot of the organisms that one requires to help promote soils like that, and or healthy soil, I should say. So I basically have just left nature to take its course, and I'll be adding, more compost. And every time I add a plant, especially from other areas of the garden, I'm bringing in more healthy soil, more healthy organisms, so they can work it out.
Excellent, excellent. We have a couple of questions. Iris is asking, were the cedar roots a problem?
No, I was surprised actually. On the other side of the hedge, I do get more trouble with them occasionally when I want to plant things. So perhaps that is actually an indicator of just how horrendous the clay was in this area, that not even a cedar root could penetrate it. So no, I haven't, but it might be a future problem, which wouldn't be great. But once I get the border established, I think they'll get along.
I also noticed that in your first picture, your cedar hedge wasn't trimmed as much as it is in this hedge. So will it continue to be trimmed and maintained in size so it doesn't take over the border?
Yes, I don't trim the hedge. I like to trim it at the very end of the year because I have quite a few birds nesting in it. So I definitely hadn't trimmed it during the spring. And actually what happened was the snow was quite late last year. So I managed to get the company to come on about the last day that they would come at all. It was well after the ground had hardened with frost. I'd cut down all the plants on both sides and they did an awesome job trimming the hedge. So it does look a lot tidier. In fact, I think in this picture, it looks a little better now.
Oh, it looks beautiful. Rebecca's asking facetiously, have you considered therapy for the shy worms?
I think they can have group therapy by making a new home for themselves.
There's another question from Iris. What did you mean by split garden bags? Can you add paper instead?
You can add any sort of paper as long as it's fairly thick. So what I did, I just took garden bags and split them open down one edge. I cut out the bottom piece actually and used that for some of the where the thicker parts where the ground was a little lower, but mostly I didn't really use the bottoms. I just used the four sides. That took actually a long time, so I'd recommend doing that the day before perhaps. And then so each bag of the kind I buy is 2-ply. So that was 2 pretty thick layers of garden bags. And I actually chose to use those because I'd noticed that if I had stored compost in them in dry areas under the soffits of my house over winter, nothing grew from under those garden bags. And I thought they are pretty tough bags. So that's why I chose those. And you can see in the early pictures that they showed at the edge, and even in the very early spring this year, they were showing at the edge, but they've completely gone now. The soil has taken care of them.
Disintegrated. Somebody mentioned whether plastic garden bags would work, and that's just a question for you. I don't think so. But
yes. No, I don't know. They won't work because they'll actually just block off all the natural processes that you want to have happen. You want the layers of soil, mulch and the clay to, I hate to use this word, but communicate, to amalgamate and to sort of infiltrate each other so that the clay gets broken down. If you put plastic there, you'll have stagnant soil, it will have no active bacteria, it'll become anaerobic underneath, and just a sort of waterlogged border above, because it won't be drainage either. So no plastic.
Yeah, I know people, you do see plastic in public spaces sometimes, and I think, as you're pointing out, there's a danger. Sandra mentioned having heard of newsprint, using newspapers. Yeah.
Yes, so I have read just recently, and I'm afraid I can't remember where it was, that there have been changes in the newsprint that to take out some of the chemicals. I'm not sure if that's entirely correct, but this isn't a vegetable bed anyway. So I'd be much more careful about that if I was going to be growing vegetables in it. I'm not. And you can see here that the plants seem to grow quite happily, almost regardless. Newspaper is mentioned a lot in the various web-based sources, so I think it's a pretty easy, accessible option.
Great, great. You pointed out at the very beginning the difference between no dig and no-till gardening, and that's, as you know, I had written and spoken about no-till gardening, which means you don't disturb the soils once they're balanced. Can you just tell us, do you think your soil will be balanced enough to not disturb it? And what are the advantages if that's the case?
Yes, I don't really plan on disturbing the soil. I would like to get it full of plants, and then their natural processes of root development and the healthy soil structure that comes with bacteria and soil should help create a really nice loamy soil in this area. As long as the plants are happy growing in a sort of alkaline base at the bottom of everything, it doesn't really matter terribly much if the clay totally breaks down. But if I keep adding layers of compost to it, as you would to any normal garden, not as thick as the layers I initially added, obviously, that will just help foster all of the natural processes that we want to go ahead and keep maintaining here. Right. If you do a lot of tilling, like disturbing the surface, you upset, or you can open up the sort of layer of mulch that lets moisture out and weeds in. Don't want to do either of those. So basically, it's best to just go where you need to go and remove weeds if you need to remove them, but try and maintain the existing layers of structure that you've got. Unless you run into a problem, in that case, have a think and see what you should do.
Great, great. There's still a bit of confusion, I think, about the bags you've used. Are they the leaf bags? You know, the garden leaf bags? Yes, that's what you mean.
There's great big leaf bags, the ones you have to get into to really open up inside. Yes, those ones. So I just split them down one side and cut out the bottom, which is about 4 layers thick. That was going to be too thick for my purposes, really. And then I opened out that, and it actually covers quite a large area once you've opened one of those out completely. Each of the bags I used has 2 layers of paper, so I had a 2-ply layer.
Great, great, great. I don't know if there are any other questions at the moment.
Well, I could add one point for you, actually, if you have time. Yes.
Sure, we do.
I had meant to add in that the plants that were there initially, they were going to get buried up to their necks in 6 inches of soil. So I very delicately lifted them each as I put in the topsoil, and filled in underneath them, so that their roots were well established in the nicer soil, and that they weren't sort of like buried up to here in mulch. And so they all rose with the tide.
I actually had that question myself. I was wondering how they weren't buried, because if you add too much mulch, you can squeeze away the life of plants. So that was the move. You dug them up. Yes. Well, thank you, Belinda. That was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Belinda, that was a wonderful presentation and most informative. Thank you so much for speaking to us today about your no dig border. It looks gorgeous. That was really fun. And next week, for those of you who are regulars here on Trowel Talk Live, we'll be getting a visit from Catherine Disley, who is a longtime professional in designing with plants, and she'll be speaking to us about healthy houseplants. and how you can ensure that you bring that greenery back into the house at the end of the season. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day.